This is the Financial Sense News Hour with the president of PFS Group, Jim Poplava. Since 1982, PFS Group has offered asset management and educational resources that have helped investors build, maintain, and preserve their wealth. Now, here's the Financial Sense News team, Jim Poplava and John Leffler.
For a long time, very few people knew what the United Nations plan called Agenda 21 was all about. Now, nor, for that matter, what had happened at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development called UNCED. Few Americans can tell you what the Rewilding Project is all about. A plan to return 50% of the United States to a wilderness area using economic means to force people off their rural property and into compact urban areas. Recently, the Wall Street Journal did a full story on it. Over the last 20 years, Americans have noticed that it's getting harder and harder to do anything with property that is technically theirs, on which they pay property tax, without jumping through a bewildering maze of government regulation and requirements and paying exorbitant permitting and mitigation fees. Running closely with this are the comprehensive planning programs flooding into many counties and cities in the country. Running under the name of, quote, smart growth or something similar, which are promoted by organizations such as ICLEI and sub-organizations trained by the same organization. When smart growth comes into a county, the residents of the county are told this is going to be their plan. Meetings are held, chaired by trained facilitators who come from out of town, usually working for ICLEI-affiliated organizations. Property owners are told their input is important. They're told that it's important that everyone's property rights be respected and preserved. But as soon as you hear the word but, citizens realize their property rights aren't going to be respected at all, and everything begins to deteriorate. When the process goes forward, they discover their input isn't really wanted at all, and that was just a ruse. The plan, they were told, is their plan, and has really been imported from radical environmental organizations and is identical, sometimes word for word, to the same regulations and laws being enacted in other cities and counties. When the plan is finally implemented into law, property owners discover they can no longer do anything with their property without permission from a bewildering maze of government agencies and NGOs, private environmental organizations, which, surprise, surprise, requires thousands of dollars in fees and permits. In many cases, property owners are forced to pay expensive mitigation fees just to obtain permission to do something with their property. Overall, the cost of doing anything skyrockets and in many cases becomes prohibitive. Counties even take aerial photos of property with every tree and bush on an owner's property being cataloged. If the owner does anything without permission, fines, penalties, and fees are sure to follow. Which brings us to the next issue of ranchers and farmers and a decade-long struggle with hordes of regulators tangling them up in litigation and prosecution. Now the EPA is using drones to snoop on American ranchers and farmers to prowl for violations of EPA regulations from the sky. With thousands of complex and often unknowable regulations, it's a sure thing that fines, fees, threats, and intimidations and expensive litigation will begin descending on American farmers as sure as night follows day. The EPA seems to be in a war with property owners, such as the case of the Sackett family in Idaho, which was threatened with massive fines exceeding $30,000 a day if they attempted to build on a property they had bought. Some EPA bureaucrat arbitrarily declared it a virtual wetland, even though it wasn't wet except when it rained. There was no method for redress or challenging the decision. Their case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the court ruled that they had to be provided a method of challenging the arbitrary ruling. Their fight is still ongoing, costing the couple thousands of dollars. Ladies and gentlemen, it's becoming clear that a well-coordinated pattern of warfare upon property owners by governmental organizations and radical environmental groups is underway. But few understand the roots of it all. We're going to explore the origins of all this and the war that is underway. Joining us on the program is Dr. Michael Kaufman. He's got a Ph.D. in forestry science from the University of Idaho. He is also currently the president of Environmental Perspectives. He was also played a key role in stopping the ratification of the Convention on Biological Diversity in the U.S. Senate. Also joining us on the program is Tom DeWeese, one of the leading advocates of individual liberty, free enterprise, property rights, and back-to-basics education, and Karen Schoen, who is a former teacher and leader of the group Agendas. Panel, I'd like to start out, and anybody jump in here. Let's begin by telling everyone, what is Agenda 21? What is this all about?
Agenda 21, came out of the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. It was a culmination of several plans that were coming out of the UN in previous international meetings. It was written by hundreds of non-governmental organizations that are private organizations using the UN as an umbrella to make their private goals, agendas, an international one. And the document they came out with, Agenda 21, which was signed by George H.W. Bush at that conference, became American policy through the Bill Clinton's President's Council on Sustainable Development. Some of the same NGOs who helped write it at the UN level served on that board. And literally, they call it an agenda because that's what it is. It is a complete change of American policy, of America's way of life, of our government, from what our founders created of a government that is limited and protects individual liberty and free enterprise and private property rights to a government of top-down edicts that, based on the idea that the environment, everything has to be based on the environment, all decisions based on that, and how any human activity whatsoever affects the environment, that's what takes precedence over anything else. But the problem with that is, because we all want to protect the environment, but the problem with that is that many times the edicts that they come up with have absolutely nothing to do with the environment. That's the excuse. One of the major tenets of Agenda 21 is social equity or social justice. You hear this being used on almost everything today. And what this really is about redistribution of wealth. It is about social programs, education programs, behavior modification, all of these kinds of things. Has nothing to do with protecting the environment. It has to do with directing individuals into a specific direction that they want us to go in. And again, it comes down to a top-down control where your local governments lose their ability to make decisions. You have the federal government creates grant programs that dictate what kind of programs can be put in place. Then you have that move into the state legislatures that then pass legislation that tells the local counties that they have to do comprehensive development plans, and those plans then have, all these strings attached. That is the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda 21 policy.
Anybody want to add to that?
I'll just go back just a few years before that, back to the 1976 Stockholm Habitat 1 conference, in which the United Nations established a precedent by which all property rights have to be controlled by the state. I can go into and read the actual document, but the key point that feeds right into what Tom was saying is that from that point on, the United Nations, every agreement, everything that they did was centered around the fact that the state itself, or the United Nations, controlled the private property rights of any particular parcel of land.
Doctor, let me stop you there for a second. How does United Nations law controlling property rights for U.S. citizens, how does that law trump U.S. constitutional law? In other words, how are they able to do that?
Tom said many of the participants in President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development basically were people that were members of an organization called the IUC, and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that wrote the treaty in the first place, and wrote, not the treaty, but the document itself, Agenda 21, in the first place, almost a dozen years before it was introduced in 1992. And as a consequence, what happened was that those very same people made sure that the concept of state control of private property rights was well embedded in what is called Sustainable America. That was the document that came out of the President's Council on Sustainable Development that Clinton set up. back in 1996. And from that point on, almost everything that the federal government has been doing is based on the fact that the state itself or the government itself has the last word on controlling property rights. And that's one of the reasons for the horde of new regulations that are coming down, none of which basically acknowledge property rights other than a few decisions that a landowner, a property owner can make within the constraints that they have put on it. It basically strips away most of the private property rights that Americans have actually had for the last 30 years or so.
Now comes in the teacher part, because the real question is, how can you get a group of people who believe in individualism and private property to do a 180 and say, I don't know about that, and I'm not going to be concerned about it, and it's okay if you steal my private property. And that was all started in the school system when, in the early 1980s, Shirley McLuhan, who was the director of the McReal organization, changed education and went to the Governor's Council, which was headed by then Governor Clinton, and she was working under George Bush 41, and she wrote at this meeting to change education, determining that students are human capital. Education's purpose is to train students to work. The purpose of education is to transform society from individualism to collectivism. And the fact-based education is no longer a primary focus of education. So when they put that type of ideology in the schools, and they started stripping away the meaning of America history, American ideology, American government, civics, they became electives. In high school, the kids don't learn history. It starts at 1865. And they are then tracked into becoming global citizens, not having any knowledge of the Constitution and their rights. So the people are at a disadvantage. And then you have these government agencies, these oppressive agencies coming in and saying, we're going to do this to you. And the people don't realize that this is not constitutional, and they have the right to say no, because they're being trained in school that this is what they have to have.
Let me ask you this. Given this controlled agenda, which is they're trying to implement here, let's talk about how they are implementing this, because in my state, one of the things that I first became aware of this was back in 2001 when I was shopping to buy a piece of property. I was looking for a ranch, and the one thing that I discovered, it didn't matter if you were buying a 100-acre parcel, a 200-acre parcel, you could build any kind of house you wanted. But when it came to building a second house, let's say you wanted to build a second house for friends and relatives to stay or hired help, there was a limitation that was placed on the square footage of that second home. Didn't matter how much land that you owned. And then all of a sudden, there was also, when you filed for your building permits, before you could place your home on the property, they would send biologists out there, and usually they took part of your land away and then turned around and give it back to you if you paid them what I call an extortion fee, which was called mitigation fees. Let's talk about how are they implementing this?
Well, this is, again, to go back a little bit to what I said in the beginning, this is Tom. As it came out of Agenda 21, as it came out of the United Nations at the 1992 Earth Summit, and came into the United States, the creation of the President's Council on Sustainable Development with these same NGOs serving on it, and along with heads of most of the individual agencies of the federal government, they began to put policies together. A lot of that was driven through grants. They put these grant programs together through the EPA, through HUD, through the Interior Department, and these grants come with strings attached, knowing full well the agenda they wanted to put in place. That's how these grants were created, and these strings were, if you took the money, you drank the Kool-Aid, then you're stuck. You've got to do these programs. You may want to have a grant just to help you revitalize downtown. How downtown is revitalized becomes a whole different thing. once these grants were put in place, the same NGOs that helped write those then went to the state legislatures, got the state legislatures to put this legislation together to force the counties to do comprehensive development plans. Then the same NGOs went into the local community and they said, well, you guys have to put these comprehensive development plans together. We know where the money is that you could help you do that. Of course, it's the grants they created, and then that's how it infiltrates into the city. Another force using those grants are the planning groups, like the American Planning Association, the APA. These guys are funded by this. And their job then becomes to come into the community and put the plan together. That's what ICLEI does. They bring in the software, they bring in all the programs, everything needed to set the community up to meet the standards that are dictated to through the grants. And then, as a public meeting, to bring the public inside, they hold these public meetings, as you mentioned, with the trained facilitators who are trained in psychology. They know that when they have a consensus meeting, his job is to, when the meeting is over, that everybody is in agreement to a pre-planned outcome, and if he's really good at it, then they all think it's their idea. And this is how things are put into place now. You go to a lot of these meetings where they're talking about people's private property, and ask how many property owners there are in the room, you probably find out there are none. I've heard that happen several times. But yet they held a public meeting, and the head of the Chamber of Commerce is on board, the head of the local college is on there, the school board is there. We in the community put all this together.
Tom, let me stop you there. Did they not publish the notice of meeting? In other words, if they have these meetings with no homeowners, I assume they're doing this in a stealth manner where the property owners aren't informed that something that's going to impact their property is going to be discussed. Did they do it in a stealth manner?
Yeah, they'll do a notice, but it'll be some little tiny thing buried down in the ads page somewhere that can't really notice it unless you're looking for it. Not the front page headline in the local newspaper that says, hey, we're going to have a whole new plan for the community. Everybody should come out and take a look at it. They don't do it that way. They just put the little notice. That's what they're required to do, as long as they do something. And they don't want you there, but if you are there, then the facilitator really knows what he's doing. If you start asking questions like, who are you people? Where did this come from? Where did the money come from for this? What's up with all this? He will either try to put his arm around you and lead you down the primrose path, or if he can see he can't do that with you, you're going to be a troublemaker, then he will begin to say to the rest of the group, well, even Tom could understand this. You know, he makes you the target. You are the village idiot. We got to tolerate you, but, let's kind of ignore him. That's what happens.
The other thing that happens, this is Mike, in those group meetings, is if they can break you down into smaller groups and put you in with another group that can override what you're saying and then dilute your whole thing by the fact that 6 other groups do not agree with you, then they can basically marginalize you into non-existence. This is the classic approach that they use to get to an endpoint long before the meeting is even held. And the unfortunate thing about it is that this whole set of tactics and so forth is predicated on the idea that man cannot be trusted to own and actively use their property in a way that's beneficial to society. That is the underlying mantra behind this whole thing. And it's basically, one of the other things that happens is when they put these little small announcements on page 35 or whatever, they will call their buddies and actually inform them. There's an actual network that is involved in this to make sure that these people come out. But, of course, the average citizen who owns the property and is going to have his property decided upon by the rest of the community has no clue as to what's going on.
During the formulation of these plans, they relied heavily on the RAND Corporation, who came up with a variety of psychological manipulative moves to get people to participate in outcome-based processes like this. And they called it Delphi technique is one of the techniques that they use. And as a matter of fact, the American Planning Association just had a seminar and came up with, I think it was 18 pages of how to respond when the, quote, homeowner, quote, asks questions that would be against, what their procedure and what their outcome is going to be. So there's an actual procedure. There are manuals training people how to facilitate these meetings. and they are, as Tom said, 100% outcome-based. So it is fortunate that we have people like Tom and that we had people like Dr. Kaufman and that we are now able to go to these meetings and break them up. And we have been doing that rather successfully. And once you realize the depth of the psychological manipulation, it's easy to see it in everything. It's easy to see it in all of the things that we do on a daily basis because they're all slanted in the same direction. I was watching a TV show last week. I don't remember which one because I was flipping mainstream media channels. And there was a commercial, and the commercial started out with something of when you get your dish bill, and the bill is too high, you feel powerless. And that word stuck with me. And then the show that I was listening to, 3 times in that show, the same thing came up. You feel powerless. You feel powerless. You feel powerless. So that whole thing was done through a subliminal psychological manipulation so that when people go to these meetings, they feel powerless. It's a whole big network of things that are integrated all to come out with the same outcome. And as Dr. Kaufman said, the outcome is getting the people off their land.
You know, it's amazing, too, because they also have enlisted the help of Hollywood. We've seen these scare movies. In fact, if you watch History Channel, Life After a Man Disappears,
yes.
You know, all these kind of scare tactics. And the Wall Street Journal did an article back just a couple of months ago, and it was called California Declares War on Suburbia. And they're talking about the regulatory and tax climate is driving businesses out of state. Now California has got a new mantra. It's declared war on the most popular housing choice, the single-family home. And by 2015, they are going to implement a program that will drive population density to 30 or more individual units or buildings per acre of land. So you must be talking about apartment complexes or condominiums. But this was all done in something that I wasn't even aware. In 2006, they called it the Global Warming Solutions Act, where they were basically going to save the planet. And they're going to adopt these high-density areas. They're going to reconstruct existing suburbia. And all of this, I mean, what are they going to do? Start bulldozing single-family homes?
The economic climate that we have today with all of the foreclosures, that's the precursor of this. Get the people out of the houses. Tell the people in the neighborhoods, oh, blight, blight, blight. We have to bulldoze your community because we have too many boarded houses. That's exactly what's going on right now in Detroit. And that's the purpose. That was the whole goal, to destroy the destruction of the middle class. And how to do that was hit them right where in their pocketbook, destroy the housing market, destroy their ability to own homes, because most of the people now, they'll never get a job that will pay what they should get to be able to go back and buy their home again. Then they're forced now into these, they will be forced into these high density, and that is just being done because of control. So I tell people when they begin to read and they begin to learn this, the first thing they should do at the top of their paper is put money, power, control, because that's what this is all about. Every single piece of Agenda 21, you can go back. Money, power, control. They all have the same messaging going right through it.
You know, one of the things I think most of our listeners would not realize, this is big business. I mean, I ran into it when I bought a piece of property back in 2001. And when I went to file for my permit to build, they sent a biologist out there. They took the plot that we were going to build on. They took that away for, I think it was a red horny-toed lizard. Then they took the next best plot, and they called it a wetland under the guise that when it rains, water flows downhill. But they would give me that wetland back if I gave them $90,000, which was almost half of what I paid for the property.
Isn't that interesting? As it does come down to money and privilege. You've got certain people who are privileged and other people who are not. And, you know, when you look at things, for example, like the Kyoto global warming treaty from 1995, where it said that the industrialized nations, in order to protect us from global warming, protect the environment, that industrial nations had to cut back on their carbon output back to 1990 levels, things that would absolutely bankrupt countries. But at the same time, China, Brazil, India were exempt from that. Now, if it's about protecting the environment, here were three nations where all the industry was growing now, where American industry was going, and we were losing it here, and suddenly they're polluting worse than America ever did, but it's okay. So if it's about protecting the environment, shouldn't everybody have to shut down? But it doesn't. You take away the land because of some kind of a suckerfish or something, but it's okay if you pay us some extra money. How is that helping the environment? We have said over and over and over again, this has absolutely nothing to do with protecting the environment. What's happening is they're using the threat of environmental Armageddon. How do you get the people of America to give up their natural rights that are guaranteed to be protected by our Constitution? How do we get them to give them up? Well, you talk about environmental Armageddon. If you don't do this, we've only got one planet, so you've got to do this. And so Americans started throwing their liberties on the bonfire like a good old-fashioned book burning, saying, we've got to protect the environment. And that's the mantra that has gotten us to this point. But when you start looking at it, the things that they're implementing, for example, we're told that we have got to protect endangered species. We've got to protect birds. A big deal about the American eagle being put on the endangered species list. If you have a bat in your home and you kill that bat, you may be fined or put in jail for it. But you can put up a forest of windmills and they will kill these raptors by the thousands every single day. Somehow that's okay. So, it has nothing to do with protecting the environment. It has to do with a vision of the future that some people want to put into place. And that includes taking away the individual liberties and the private property rights of every person in this country.
Let me break in here. This is Mike. One of the things that I have found in the whole agenda for Agenda 21 and the smart growth characteristics of what we've been talking about is that because you are putting in so many regulations that often are cross-purpose to each other, and you're basically giving bureaucrats so much power that the tendency for corruption just skyrockets. And you see this everywhere. We've been talking about it for the last 10 minutes about how the process is so totally corrupted because you have people who have ideologies that just don't work, that basically are right out of a pie in the sky type of ideas, and yet they're forcing this on the economy. Europe right now, in part, is going bankrupt because of all of the Clean Air Act activities that they're trying to do, put the windmills, solar panels, and so forth, and there's schisms now being developed in almost schizophrenic schisms in Germany and England and so forth, where the government policy is to go to all this alternative energy while the people and many of the people in their parliaments and so forth are basically saying, we can't afford to do that. It's bankrupting us. This is what happens when you get into this never land of environmental justice and so forth that we are coming out of with this Agenda 21. And unfortunately, and that's just one of the reasons I wrote my new book, Plundered, is the fact that it's being perpetrated by a very small percentage of the population called progressives. But it dominates our legislative process, it dominates our educational process, it dominates our judicial process, it dominates almost every institution in this country because these people seek power. They believe that they have the right answers for anything, nobody else is going to matter, and they have to get in positions of power to be able to implement it, and that's what's happened. And I would say this right now, we have to get those kinds of people out of those positions of power in this next election.
And we also have to make a difference in the schools, because the schools now are teaching to emotion with an outcome-based education. So the plan is there. Your child is tracked. Your kid says in 5th grade, I want to be a mechanic. Well, he's going to go in the mechanic track. Well, let's say in the 8th grade, he decides he wants to be a doctor. Too bad, you're in the mechanic track. You lose. With that, the kids are then being forced and manipulated in an emotional vein. So then you can take crisis upon crisis. You've got a whole slew of people that can just work on an emotion, The minute you give them the crisis, their emotion starts reacting, and they're ready to give you anything to get rid of that crisis. Make it go away. Make it stop. Make it stop. So we're training them in school to do all of these things.
Let me inject something here. If this treaty was rejected, the Biodiversity Treaty, why then is our government implementing it? In other words, if the Senate rejected it, why are they implementing it at the state level? How did they get away with doing that?
That is a very good question. I'm glad you asked that. Basically, I began to tumble onto this back in the late 1980s of what was going on. And I realized that much of our government services, the bureaucrats in our various agencies, were part of this progressive ideology that was gung-ho to lock up the land for nature. And out of that came the Wildlands Project that was written by the principals in the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, this IUCN, which made up half of the board that is President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development that created Sustainable America that we're now suffering from. Even though we stopped it 1 hour before the ratification vote or the closure vote was to be taken in the 1990s, and it stopped. It has never been brought up again since, even though it could be. But the federal agencies, the environmental organizations, through conservation easements and so forth, are locking up tremendous areas of land around the country, using this as their template, even though it was never ratified in the U.S. Senate. And that basically, I believe, is against the law. It is really outrageous. I live in the state of Maine, and right now Maine has over 2 million acres locked up. Less than 5% of our land was under public control 10 years ago, and now over 2 million acres. Florida, for instance,
Florida's a mess.
Florida's for a mess. They basically have almost 6 million acres now locked up that they've done over the last 10 or 15 years. It's being done one step at a time now, even though it could have been done unilaterally had the treaty been ratified.
And Mike, isn't it true that the Clinton administration pulled the heads of all the agencies together and they had a discussion on how much of the biodiversity treaty they could implement without it being the rule of law and without changing any other laws in the already in existence?
Absolutely. I have an internal working document dated 1993. 1994 is when the Senate was considering ratifying the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the EPA and most of the other agencies had other internal working documents that paralleled this that basically said that they had to begin to implement the international law, rules and treaties that were coming out, even though they had not even been ratified by the U.S. Senate yet. This was a goal by the various agencies, still was during the Bush administration, Clinton administration, even, and of course now the Obama administration. Even though that had never been ratified, many of these goals have been systematically implemented by these agencies deliberately. They were even doing it before the treaty came out for ratification.
Agenda 21 encompasses everything. It's not just land. It is a total inventory of you, the person, who now must belong to the state. So you, the person, then becomes the commodity. And your value is how much can you work and give to the state. And now if you take a look even at the healthcare and the healthcare law, there is a tremendous amount of rationing that is in there that people don't realize. There's a tremendous amount of damage that's going to be done to seniors, to people who are infirm, to people who are not, quote, deemed sufficient that they will be useful enough for the state. So they will be cast away. So it's not just Agenda 21 is property rights. Agenda 21 is to change the entire mindset of an individual from freedom into one of subservience and slavery, as you will work for the state.
Reminds me of Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. It seems like we're traveling at warp speed.
Yeah.
It is exactly that. If you go back and you look further and go back far enough in history, the Rockefeller brothers in the 50s, I think, wrote an agenda. They called it the Unfinished Agenda. And in the 30s, the Carnegies went to Wilson, the Carnegie Institute, and they wanted to figure out how they would be able to change the people's mindset from freedom into subservience, without war, because the only way they did it before was with war. And they realized that if they instituted the psychological manipulation, the stimulus response, the Pavlov's dogs in the schools, that as the people graduated, gradually their mindset would change. So now we have a group of people that have no idea what freedom and liberty are. They have no idea what their rights are. They have no idea about anything, and they think nothing of going in the street and carrying a sign and saying, yay communism, yay socialism, yay thisism, yay thatism, because they have no idea. 86% of our students today are graduating school thinking that the only place that they can succeed is to get something from the government.
You know, it's amazing that we see that, because you'll see this in a lot of the press interviews. Well, they'll interview some of the younger people and they'll ask them why they're either protesting or how they feel about a certain candidate, and they can talk in cliches. And then when the reporter asks them to go more in depth into the issue beyond the cliche, they can't think. They respond back and they seem frustrated.
There is no thought process. Usually, and this is something that I attribute to Dr. Kaufman, after listening to one of his seminars, I started talking to some people who were progressive. And I made a statement, which was a statement of fact. And they attacked me. They attacked my personality. They attacked what I was wearing. They attacked my hair. They attacked this. They attacked that. And then they were finished. And I said to them, okay, now that you have told me all the adjectives in the world, this is the fact. You haven't mentioned it. Where is it written? They can't answer that because nothing that they do is based on fact, as Shirley said. Education is no longer a knowledge of fact. It is a knowledge of value. Well, whose value? The value comes out of the United Nations. This is why our schools are in such dire problems, and Race to the Top is a program that is modeled after the old Soviet school-to-work program. Get the kids in the career clusters, they called them, so that every charter school then becomes a career cluster for engineering or a career cluster for science. So that kid is identified early on as they are putting in their apps and they're doing everything with technology because they've got all these logarithms in there. And they then say, pick up, oh, well, this kid used this word 15 times, so they must be good for doing this job. And then they track that kid and ease them into a program for that job. Well, the child or the student is no longer making a choice on their own. Education was you get the tools, you get everything that you need to then be able to go in your life and make a successful choice as to what you wanted to do in your life using the tools you learned. It's not like that anymore. The child is now guided into this outcome-based education to follow along this path of what the government has decided as they have chosen through the answers to the questions that the kids have given on a variety of tests.
So going back to what you were saying about the students not being able to answer you when they were hitting you with all the cliches, I found it really interesting. Back in June, the Heartland Institute put together a conference on global warming that featured all of the scientists who don't agree with the global warming issues. And outside were a bunch of protesters. And so Lord Monckton, who is one of the greatest spokesmen in the country or in the world on that issue, and Mark Moreno, who matches him, two of the greatest spokesmen, decided to go out and debate these guys and see what they were up to. So they take video camera in hand and they go out to confront these protesters. And right on the camera, one of the protesters says, "I'm not allowed to talk to you." And when they started to say anything about a fact, the leaders of this group started up a chant to drown them out. That was their entire response. There was not a single thread of debate or discussion or issue mentioned. It was just, we've got to shut these guys up and hold your hands over your ears and don't listen to a word they say. It might take you onto the dark side.
Well, the heads of these groups view people not as individuals. People you are only as good as your group. So you have no ability for an individual anything. And if you make an individual discussion, as you just said, you get ostracized, bullied, and names are called and things like that. So the kids then, they become within, they are afraid to say anything, and then they are like triggers as they are emotionally guided to respond to some kind of stimulus. Fact is never part of anything that they do because the fact is the truth, and they, going back again to the Communist Manifesto, the ends justify the means. It doesn't matter how you get there, lie to get empowered. That's what this is all about. So therefore, fact is no longer important. It's a value that we are now teaching in school.
One of the things that caused me to write my book, Plundered, was I tumbled onto a book written in 1895 by an early psychiatrist who was observing the same phenomenon back in the late 1800s. And basically he described the modern-day progressive. And he basically said they cannot connect to facts. They cannot connect reality. They're extremely emotional. They usually will interrupt. They'll usually go by slogans and so forth. They do not think. And so everything that we've been talking about this last 45 minutes was being described in 1895 by the psychiatrist of this group of people who were actually, at that time, changing Europe into a socialist nation.
I want to get back to smart growth because it's being implemented across the country. And the programs are designed in very manipulative ways. You talk about, well, we had a town hearing, but nobody was notified about it. And then they have their facilitators there. These programs are designed to slide right through. I mean, I live in a private community, and I was just absolutely blown away recently where I went through a remodel. I had the HOA, I had the county, I had the city, and I had a regional environmental group that I had never even heard of. There were 4 entities on talking about a simple remodel. Each required fees. Each had a different way of looking at the project. Each had different requirements, often conflicting with each other. It was a nightmare and maze where I had to get attorneys involved in this just to kind of sort it out. So if they're doing this, is there anyone having any luck stopping them from implementing this, or are they just sliding this through like California all across the country?
Now you're down to my favorite subject. What we are doing across the country. As Mike can tell you, for 20 years, 18 years, we were pretty lone voices in talking about this, trying to have people hear us and understand what we were warning them about. Farmers, ranchers, people in the mining industry, the timber industry heard us. They were the frontline victims of all this, and they understood over those 18 years what they were facing. But that's where the battle is being fought. In the last 2 years, suddenly it's come to the cities to a point that people can see it and they're feeling it. It has been absolutely remarkable what has taken place. The planners, the people who have been implementing this, are shocked and don't know what to do about it because you've got people rising up in county commission meetings and consensus meetings and city council meetings, even in the legislatures across the country, and they're standing there almost dumbfounded as they're watching what's taking place. And literally what it's done is, first of all, we're tracking it, I believe the figure at the moment is 136 communities, somewhere around there, have now rescinded their memberships in the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, ICLEI. That's not a victory in itself. I mean, that doesn't get rid of Agenda 21 in the community, but it fires a shot across their bow, and it makes people very aware of what's going on there. That has shocked them. The American Planning Association has put together boot camps to train their planners how to counter us, and they're coming up with these Orwellian words and ways to go about this. In fact, I've got in my hand from the American Planning Association the glossary for the public, and in the introduction it says, given the heightened scrutiny of planners by some members of the public, what is said or not said is especially important in building support for planning. And then they go through a whole list of words. They say these make our critics see red, so don't use these words. They include Delphi technique, consensus, density, public visioning, regionalism, smart growth, sustainability, and I've joked that soon they're going to have to do all their presentations with sign language because they won't have any words left. So,
it's a good one, Tom.
This is what's going on. Now they've called out the big guns, the New York Times and the Southern Poverty Law Center and all of these guys to do everything they can to ridicule our movement, to make us look like we're a bunch of tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorist nuts. But it's not working. The protests are growing because exactly what we've talked about today, these policies that are ripping our communities apart, taking away our private property rights, people are not going to sit back and let them do that. So, and we're beginning to train people on how to counter them countering us. And so it's getting to be a real political judo going on, but it's amazing to watch their panic. Another point of this is the Rio Plus 20 conference that was just held in June. This was the 20 years after the creation of Agenda 21. They were coming together to finish the job, to put cross all the T's and dot all the I's, and then move on with this. Well, after their absolute collapses of the global warming conferences in Copenhagen and Durban, they decided that they were going to rebrand their movement away from climate change and global warming to sustainable development. And that was the purpose, the underlying thing they were doing in Rio. And I jumped for joy over that because I'm busy building an army across this country, turning the word sustainable development into political poison. So come on, guys, let's do it. But yeah, we're having some incredible success around the country. 7 legislatures have passed some sort of legislation, either stopping mandatory comprehensive development plans as they did in Florida. They're working on the same thing in Wisconsin. The state of Alabama passing legislation that says Agenda 21 is illegal. The Republican National Committee unanimously passing a resolution against Agenda 21. We aren't winning for sure, but as I describe it, this is D-Day. We're on Normandy Beach, and we have established a beachhead on Utah Beach, and we're moving inward.
So the wonderful work that Dr. Kaufman and Tom Deweese did made it easier for myself on the education part to use that information to then turn around and create the group that we created, which is called the Agenders. And the Internet is making it easy for us to communicate with each other from across the country, because their original intent, all of this won't work if the people are educated. How do they keep us separated? That's their divide and conquer. Well, the fact that people are beginning to say, wait a minute, this is happening here, and now recognizing, no, it's not just happening to you in your little town, it's happening to other towns. So we're coming together, and because of Tom and Mike, that we are able to do it at the depth that we're able to do.
Why don't you change the name, Tom, from Smart Growth to No Growth?
They're working on that.
Some growth.
Yeah, they are.
One of the things they talked about at Rio Plus 20 was that we would have a no growth or zero growth economy. They literally were advocating a zero growth economy because growth means we damage the environment. I mean, that's how insane these people are. But, Obama, if that is the new economic direction, Obama has been brilliant at it, zero growth. But, that's how nuts they are, but they're doing that, yeah.
The goal is the redistribution, and if you look at these programs, and coming from a math background, they're devoid of math. There is absolutely no financial information in them. There's no scientific information, no statistical information, and they have no track record because they don't work. They're designed not to work. Then you have to go back and say, well, why would they do that and design them not to work? Well, what is their goal? Their goal is to eliminate the middle class. Because under a socialist system, you can only have 2 classes of people. You cannot have a huge layer of people that are allowed to accumulate wealth, because wealth is unsustainable. Private property is unsustainable. All of these things are unsustainable because it has to be reserved for the good of the collective. So as they have begun to try to eliminate the middle class, and we the Americans, they forgot that we can get engaged if we get educated, and we're not going to sit back and let this happen. But the challenge is educating the people quickly enough for them to get to understand. And that has come, as I said before, from Tom and Mike, and thank God from the Internet, because that has allowed us the communication that was lacking before.
You know what this seems to me? If you look at this, it really reminds me of what we call 21st century feudalism, where you have the elites at the top, who, by the way, are exempt from all the urban density. I mean, look at Al Gore. He flies around on a private jet, and he has an estate that consumes enough electricity to power 10 homes. Not to mention the fact that him and his Goldman partners are working on the cap and trade monopoly in terms of trading credits. The other thing that reminds me of, too, is right out of Orwell's book. I mean, when you hear the word smart growth, what it really means is no growth.
We learned all of that, as Dr. Kaufman said, in our history. This is not a new thing. And if you go back and you look in the Russian history, that's exactly where it's coming from. They had to create these city-states. They had to put these walled cities. The people within that city, each city had a purpose. Your city might be producing light bulbs. Somebody else's city might be producing something else. How did the people get from one city to the next? That's where the high-speed rail comes in, because they have to eliminate the automobile. It's really, if you think about what it is, what was the figure that they came out with a couple of weeks ago? Sales for cars are down. Well, if you're teaching a group of kids not to use cars, then the parents aren't going to go out and buy cars for graduation. So, of course, the sales for the cars are going to go down. Same thing. If you outsource people's jobs, how can they pay their mortgages? So they do things, as Mike said, they do things that contradict each other, because in reality, these programs are not supposed to work. They're just supposed to cost a lot of money.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned was the whole concept of feudalism. And one of the things that I showed the U.S. Senate that stopped the Convention on Biological Diversity from being ratified was a section out of the Global Biodiversity Assessment that was in part written by the IUCN. It always goes back to these same institutions. Was basically the idea that the only form of government that's going to work under their new ideas of what has to happen is the feudal system of government, where you have two classes of people. And when you consider what's happened here in this country and the loss of the jobs and so forth, the industry and so forth in this country that's been shipped overseas because of regulations and taxation, you can begin to see how they're doing it.
Bringing this to a conclusion, the things that we're talking about here, unless you've been a property owner looking to buy property, a rancher, a farmer, where you have to deal with the government, where they're trying to basically shut you down or make it so difficult, I've come across this twice before I even understood what we were calling it. Once in 2001 when I bought property, and more recently through a remodel, where I had to hire attorneys to deal with 4 different entities. I mean, this is really astounding. So how do our listeners become informed, gentlemen? How can they follow this when it's coming to their community? When you're certainly, the media is complicit with this agenda, because they certainly don't bring it to the attention in the nightly news that ICLEI is coming. Smart growth hearings are going to be held in your city, or for that matter, it's probably buried in the back pages of the local newspaper.
They do need to stay alert. First of all, they need to learn what it is. And we all have websites, mindsamericanpolicy.org, with lots of information on that, articles on what it is, how to fight back, and so forth. They need to educate themselves. The other thing is, this is a case where I don't believe that you can go down to City Hall and fight it by yourself. You've got to organize. Don't rush into the City Hall and start yelling that they are implementing United Nations policies. What is the policy that you're objecting to, and why are you objecting to it? Because it's invading your private property or controlling it, because it's hurting the economy, or you're raising the cost of energy, or whatever the case may be, and figure out who's affected by that. Who are the people who are going to be the victims of it? It may not be everybody in town. It may just be a certain section, or it may be everybody. But make those people your allies. And when you go to, your councilmen, your county commissioners, begin to talk to them on that basis about what's wrong with this policy. You don't have to educate them on everything you know, that it all came from the United Nations and Agenda 21. There's a reason why this policy is wrong, and go after it. Mainly, start asking questions. First of all, if they're bringing in a new planning group to put a program together, ask them a question. What guarantees, Mr. Councilman, do we have that you or these planners that you're bringing in here are going to protect our private property rights and honor those rights? Because tell me a politician is going to say, hey, we're not going to play with that. No, we don't care about your private property. They're going to say, oh, of course we are. And you need to get that pledge out of them and enforce the issue that way, because everybody concerned about their private property and their rights to it. And so start with it on that level. You can extend it from there as the issue goes on, but from the very beginning of it, ask them the question, what are you going to do to protect my private property rights? And you might stop them in their tracks in some cases.
We tell everybody that our website is Agenda 21 today. We are connected with Mike and with Tom, and that's the beauty of all of this. And I tell everyone that when you read Agenda 21, and everybody should, there will be something in there that sticks out that is more egregious to you than somebody else. You become the expert in that field, and then work with a group of people, and then share information. When you go to your planning, the first thing that I always tell everyone to do is pull down their vision plan and take a look at because it's called different things in different communities, but every state, every community, every county has one. And the first thing that you do is take that plan and in the search box, type in private property rights. You won't find that there. And that's how you start the conversation with your elected officials. How could they sign on to something that that's so huge and doesn't include private property rights? Then, of course, you get them to say to you, well, I guess I didn't read it as good as I should, or I didn't read it. Well, how can you pass something that you haven't read? And once you get them in that position where now they're questioning, then you can work with them. So you've got to get them to the spot where they recognize that something was wrong, and you can then bring them around that way using all of the tools that are available. And Mike has a slew of websites. So
one of the more recent websites that I have is called America Plundered, and it's about my book, Plundered, How Progressive Ideology is Destroying America. And if you want, in fact, you need to have a background of how all this happened and who's behind it and what they did to bring it about and so forth is in that book called Plundered, How Progressive Ideology Has Destroyed America, and is on AmericaPlundered.com. But there is a host of information on Tom's websites and other websites, like Karen has just mentioned, that really will start to provide you the information that you need as to how to go in and actually begin to turn the process back on their heads. And I would only encourage you now, a radical progressive or environmentalist or whatever can walk in and be nasty and rude and everything else and get away with it. You can't. You need to be very nice. You need to be civil and so forth, and basically make your case on the truth and facts rather than on emotion. Now, if somebody's hurt in the process, like the Sacketts were in Idaho and so forth, yes, make an emotional case. Show them how this process basically is so destructive to families or whoever is hurt by the process. But don't be personally negative about it. Lead them into the process.
And the other thing is, as part of the agendas on our website, Agenda 21 Today, we send out newsletters on a continual basis. Sign up and get the newsletters. We are starting a webinar series, and Mike is going to be, myself and others who have gone through this experience, we're going to be offering webinars because the best way is education. And once people realize the hardest thing, when I talk to people, the hardest thing for people to understand, and it was me too, we all did, is to realize that almost everything that we're doing today is based on a lie. Every government policy is based on somebody's made-up, outcome-based vision of how they want you to behave. And once you can grasp that, you can see it by the things that they are implementing, and you can then begin to realize that, wait a minute, this is not to fix some tree. In Florida, they closed down the whole lumber industry for a woodpecker. It wasn't about the woodpecker. It was about getting those farmers not being able to cut down those trees, pushing the tree business into the favored group of the politicians who want that company to now be producing the paper and not the independent people, and taking away their land, because once you take away their livelihood, they can't pay their taxes, and then they lose their land, which was the ultimate goal to begin with. So when you begin to realize it follows a pattern, and that's the nice thing about it, the only nice thing about this is everything is done the same way. It's a pattern. And once you recognize that pattern, it makes it easy to see it, and once you can see it, it makes it easy to work together with people to stop it.
Well, listen, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this roundtable and talking about this egregious attempt to take away property rights, control. This, along with global warming, are two of the major issues that they're using along with health. As we close, would each one of you give out your website? And Karen, we'll begin with you.
We are the Agenders, and we are Americans Against Agenda 21. Our website is agenda21today.com, and on there you will find a wealth of educational material for every aspect of Agenda 21. So please don't try to look at this all in one day. It won't work. And contact us with questions. That's the other thing. You have questions. Don't hold them to yourself. Questions are important. We'll answer them. So please join us, become an Agender, and learn how we can together take our country back.
Tom?
Yeah, Tom DeWeese, American Policy Center. Our website is AmericanPolicy.org. We have about a 17-year archive on there of articles that I've written, reports we've done on Agenda 21, and a lot of other issues as well. We have our action alert system called Sledgehammer. When something happens on Capitol Hill or elsewhere, we'll put out information. You can sign up for it. It's free, done by email. And we've also created the Stop Agenda 21 Action Kit, which you can see on the website and can get it. And my book there is Now Tell Me I Was Wrong, which was a collection of about 15 years of articles on these issues where I was told I was nuts. Now I see editorials that sound exactly like I wrote them. And so we called it that. Now Tell Me I Was Wrong. AmericanPolicy.org is our website.
And Dr. Kaufman?
Michael Kaufman, and our website, the one I will give you, is AmericaPlundered.com. That's for my book, but it has links into a lot of other things as well that we're involved in. And I would advise when you get onto that website, the first chapter is actually there. You can read that because that's astonishing enough in itself. But the section dealing with today's news, I go back maybe 6 or 8 months, almost a year, and show how this is being implemented from the news articles, news headlines of the day. And it is astonishing when you begin to see how they're implementing this actually happening in the news from various parts of the world.
May I add one more thing?
You sure can.
It's very important that everybody reads the Constitution.
Yeah.
Because we focus on property rights, but America's exceptionalism is based on equity, and that's private equity, your business, as well as your property rights, because everything is being assaulted. So, yes, it is egregious against land, but also businesses. The government was never supposed to be involved in the businesses and doing the things that they're doing, because basically what the goal is to put the small business out of business and push everything into corporations that eventually would become in partnership with the government under government-controlled, nationalized corporations. That's what this movement is moving towards.
It's crony capitalism.
That's fascism.
Yep, fascism is what it is. It's fascism. It's a combination of all the isms. And progressivism, collectivism, all the isms put together have come together all to roost in this one policy and plan.
All right. Well, listen, Dr. Kaufman, Tom DeWeese, and also Karen Schoen, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this roundtable on Agenda 21. Keep up the good work.
Well, thank you
for having us.
Jim, today's program ends the 2-week series we've been doing called Behind the Curtain. We had quite a panoply of guests. By the time we got done doing these interviews before we left for vacation, I think we were both brain dead and both of our vocal cords had fallen out.
You know, I think this had to be a record, John. I can't remember which day, but I thought we did like 6 or 7 interviews. It was just like, I remember talking to Liz, and she said, okay, what did you guys talk about? You do so many of these that you almost forget some of the subject matter. But anyway, next week we'll come back with our regular programming format. We'll also continue on with our Lifetime Income series. We're going to also be featuring some special guests in that Lifetime series. We'll be talking to an estate tax attorney, because remember, if the fiscal cliff is not postponed beginning January 1st, a major whopping change in estate tax rates. They move from 35% to 55%, and the exemption drops from $5 million down to $1 million. So we're going to have an estate tax attorney on the program. We'll also have somebody from a trust department. You know, I could almost write a book and tell you about some horror stories that take place, the way individuals sometimes leave the beneficiaries of their estate, or the kind of trustees. But anyway, we're going to talk about corporate trustees, their purpose, and why you may want to consider them. So a lot of great stuff coming up in the weeks ahead as we continue our Lifetime Income series. We have a lot of special guests coming up on our premium service in the month of September. And of course, we'll continue with our regular format. In the meantime, on behalf of John Loeffler and myself, we'd like to thank you for joining us here on the Financial Sense News Hour. Until you and I talk again, we hope you have a pleasant weekend.
You can subscribe to Financial Sense News Hour in the iTunes and BlackBerry podcast libraries, or at feeds.feedburner.com/FSN. Find more information about our guests at www.financialsense.com/newshour. Friend us at www.facebook.com/financialsenseonline. For our on-the-go listeners, you can access Financial Sense on your mobile device at m.financialsense.com. The Financial Sense News Hour is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the News Hour each involve their own unique risk factors, which are not discussed on the show. Responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of James Poplava and do not take into account listeners' suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Financial Sense News Hour and its parent company shall not be liable for any financial losses that result from investing in any companies profiled on or advertising with Financial Sense, or arising out of the use of any material on the News Hour. Be advised that you invest at your own risk.